All right, so I'm going to get us started. I'm so sorry to those joining us this morning for the slight delay on getting our webinar kicked off, but now I'm really glad to welcome you all and get us started. So my name is Emily Broad-Lieb, and I direct the Food Law and Policy Clinic at Harvard Law School, which is one of the hosts of today's webinar, along with the Global Food Banking Network and Food Systems for the Future. And I want to just start by giving a little bit of background about the Global Food Donation Policy Atlas Project, which is what this webinar is hosted under, and share a little bit of ground setting before we turn to our amazing speakers for today. So you can, on the next slide, see an image from the Global Food Donation Policy Atlas, which is a collaboration between the Food Law and Policy Clinic at Harvard and Global Food Banking Network. And the project was really inspired by looking at systems level policies and decisions that governments are making that are at this paradox of really high rates globally of food loss and waste, at the same time that we see really high rates of hunger and food insecurity. And not all of that food that is wasted could go to people in need, but a really large portion of it is safe, it's edible, and it goes to waste because it's surplus, because it's not beautiful, because it's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so our work has really been trying to map the policies in countries around the world to really understand what are the best practices for government to reduce barriers to distributing the food that's safe and edible to those who need it. So this is sort of an image from our site. So the next slide, you can see the goals for today's webinar. This webinar is one in a series, and we've done webinars on a range of different policy topics. In every one, we really try to highlight best practices with speakers from different countries. So today, again, we're kind of highlighting practices from a bunch of different countries. And the goals are to understand in today's webinar the benefits of using government grants or infrastructure funding or other incentives that have been used to support food waste reduction and food recovery in today's case in France, in the US, in the UK. And then we'll also hear from my colleague Trevor Finley about some other practices that we've been documenting in our work around the world. So we're going to identify some of the different types of programs, hear best practices, and then we'll have time for discussion and Q&A and to hear from those of you who are joining us today about what other ideas or questions you have. So taking a step back, you can see here just briefly, I talked a little bit about the Atlas, but our goals have been to share relevant laws. We're right now in almost 25 countries. The one that's coming shortly is Vietnam, which will come out this summer, but we've gone country by country to really map the laws and common legal barriers, recommend policy change, increase global engagement through webinars like this and through our website, and then provide strategic technical assistance to partners in countries that are then trying to use this information to have actionable ideas for how to move forward. So the legal issues that we've covered on the next slide, here we go, are these 7 main issues. We've now branched out into a few other ones, like our last webinar was on reporting on like ESG, Scope 3, and food waste reporting. So new policy area, but these are the 7 core areas that we've looked at across all of the countries. And these really arose from, in the first year of the project, talking to stakeholders in 5 countries to understand from them what are the common issues that come up for you? What are the questions that you have? What are getting in the way of donating? And so you can see on here in the bottom right, government grants and incentives is the only topic of these 7 that we haven't yet covered in a webinar. And we will follow up with an issue brief, really delving into this topic as well. And on the Atlas website, which we'll give you the link a little bit later, you can get issue briefs now and some of the webinars or synopses of the webinars for all of these other topics as well. The next slide shows, here's a couple screenshots from our website. So there is a map. You can scroll by some of these policy issues and click on each one to see a map generate that shows some of the strong policies, some of the more moderate or limited policies, and then in red are countries that have no policy on that topic. And then you can also read resources country by country. And then the next slide shows also the policy component of our website. It's also organized by policy issue. So if you go to the site, you click on policy issues, you can click on, today's topic is grants and incentives. So eventually this webinar will be housed there along with an issue brief that summarizes some of the best practices. And you can also look there for all these other issue briefs that you can see listed here. Food safety for donations, tax incentives, liability protection. So one more slide I want to share quickly before I start introducing our speakers. This is the map from our website of government grants and incentives, which is the topic for today. And you can see, like all the other topics, what we've done is really analyze what different countries are doing and come up with metrics to figure out who has sort of strong policies, where are there, moderate policies, et cetera. So the green are strong policies, and this means countries that have really laid out, some clear funding streams. They've made them available, and they've been ongoing sources of funding and resources for food waste reduction and for food recovery. So you can see there the US, Canada, and the UK. I will say that for now, the entire EU is not lit up country by country, but we know from our work that France is also a model, and that is why we're going to hear today from our colleague in the French Ministry of Agriculture and Food Sovereignty. And then what we have in yellow and orange are countries where either there has been some funding, but it's been like sporadic from time to time, or some of the orange ones are countries where there's been an announcement of funding, but we haven't really seen evidence that it's gone forward or been fully implemented. And then in red, we see countries where there hasn't really been, from the national government level, funding resources or other incentives for food recovery. So turning to our session, I'm going to, in a moment, turn it over to our moderator, Ertharin Cousin, who has been a wonderful partner in this webinar series and an amazing moderator and leader. So before I introduce her, just to give you a sense of where we're going, Ertharin's going to lead us for the rest of the session in introducing and going through our wonderful speakers. And then once they're finished their presentations, we'll have a moderated discussion. So Ertharin, I know, always has a lot of great questions. And then we'll open it up for a Q&A from all of you that are joining us today. And you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time to join the conversation, ask questions, get involved. So with that, let me introduce Ertharin Cousin, our wonderful moderator, who's going to take it from here. She's the CEO and founder of Food Systems for the Future, which is supporting this series along with Global Food Banking Network. She's a visiting scholar at the Center on Food Security and Environment at Stanford and is also a distinguished fellow at the Chicago Council for Global Affairs. She previously served as executive director of the World Food Program and as U.S. ambassador to the UN agencies for food and agriculture. So with that, Ertharin, are you ready to take it away?
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. I'm assuming you can. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. I am so delighted again to join you today for this very, very important dialogue. As we talk about the work that is necessary to make the changes that are required for us to support the sustainable transformation of the food system for environmental health, human health, as well as for the return that is necessary for all actors across the food system. Funding and the policies and laws to implement the work that is necessary to reduce the food loss and waste are critical to achieving those goals. And so this conversation today is very, very important to ensuring that there's an understanding about what is necessary for effectively moving forward. And as the moderator, you didn't come here to listen to me. You came here to listen to the experts who are going to bring us the information that is required for us to begin to think about the work ahead of us to make the changes that are necessary. So what we're going to do today is start with short presentations, and which are remarks from each of our panelists, followed by a moderated discussion amongst the panels. panelists. I will, of course, moderate that discussion, but what is critical to the success of this webinar today is your participation, ensuring that you are providing us with the questions that are necessary for you, those of you who are listening to this webinar, whether live or on tape, and that you receive the information required to support your work as you move forward. So we need your questions. So please type questions into the Q&A box. You can do this in either English or Spanish, and we'll try to answer as many of those questions as possible. But let me begin by introducing our impressive group of panelists from around the world. They are Mawin Lahore, PhD, she's the project manager fighting against food waste and insecurity and promoting sustainable food for the French Ministry of Agriculture. Ali Gourli, Public Affairs Policy and Campaigns Consultant for FareShare UK. Carrie Calvert, Vice President of Government Relations for Feeding America. And Trevor Findlay, the clinical instructor in the Food Policy and Law Clinic at the Harvard Law School. So each of the speakers will present for about 5 to 7 minutes. And we'll start with our guest from the French Ministry of Agriculture. So let me introduce Mawin. We'll hear from her, and please help me pronounce your name correctly, Mawin.
It's Mawin Loa.
Mawin Loa.
Exactly.
And all of my friends in Paris always say to me, what I lack in pronunciation, I make up for with enthusiasm. So I hope you will accept that from me, Mawin. Mawin Lahore is a project manager fighting against food waste and food insecurity for the Ministry of Agriculture in France. Mawin is an agricultural engineer with a doctorate in agroecology and microbiology, along with 2 master's degrees, one in biology, ecology and evolution, and the second in the conservation of biodiversity. Over to you, my friend.
Thank you. So it's an honor to give this talk on French policy to promote food donation. France has put in place a strong donation policy based on a combination of 3 levels. So next slide, please. Again, next slide. Yeah, again. That's the right one. So the first level is the implementation of legislative measures. The second one is the introduction of an incentive system, including tax exemption. And the last one is the use of a territorial level with the territorial food projects. So next slide, please. Again. So first point, I will present you the French legislation that permits to develop food donation. So legislation provides a general framework that favors food donation. The Gawatt law specifies a hierarchy of actions to fight against food waste that brings the action to donate at the top of the actions to implement after the prevention of food waste. There is also a law that makes it compulsory to destroy food that it is still edible for retailers, collective catering, and the agri-food industry operators. So next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah. More specifically, I can also mention the obligation for targeted big operators of retail, collective catering, food industry, and wholesalers to offer donation agreement to food aid association. There is also the obligation to set up a donation quality management plan to ensure the quality of donation, involving employee training and awareness training. This donation quality management plan was reinforced with the AGEC law by introducing some procedures for monitoring and controlling the quality of donation. So let's move on the second point. So the incentive measure to develop food donation. The first tool to that favors food donation is the National Food Program, so Programme National de l'Alimentation in French. This program sets out the objectives of food policy in France. This program provides a national call for projects, which is a concrete incentive to implement the food policy. For instance, several projects that contribute to favor food donation are funded by the SMIN. Next slide, please. France is also known for its incentive policy in terms of donation, which is based on the tax exemption process. In France, food donation leads to tax reduction of 60% of the value of the donation. The terms and conditions of tax exemptions are set out in the French General Tax Code, so Code Général des Impôts in French. Moreover, donated products are also exempted from VAT regularization, so this makes donation attractive for donors. I'd like also to mention another incentive measure which was introduced by the AGEC law. It's the National Anti-Food Waste label. This label rewards actors across the food chain who are exemplary in the fight against food waste. In the case of the distribution label, donations are rewarded. So lastly, I'd like to raise the final point, which consists in leveraging the territories. Indeed, France considers that a territorial action is a high value lever. France has followed this approach by putting in place an innovative tool that aims to relocate agriculture and food production in the territories. This tool is known as Territorial Food Projects, so PAT in French. And these territorial food projects are designed to promote the installation of farmers, short circuits, and sustainable and quality products in collective catering. They are run up collectively on the initiative of stakeholders in a given territory. So it can be local authorities, agricultural and agri-food businesses, citizens, but also food aid association. This project play an essential role in spinning up the transition to agriculture and food by bringing together producers, processors, distributors, and food aid association, for example, by coordinating all the initiatives to develop the sustainable and agriculture in the territory. There are currently more than 430 projects in France, and the law specifies that these projects must aim to fight against food insecurity with a view to adopt a systemic approach, whether by linking association and donors, pooling diagnostic tools, and creating local processing structures, for example. And finally, France is, of course, at your disposal to discuss the different levels and to cooperate with a view to improving food donation. So that's why the final touch of my speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those. Thank you very much for those really important comments. And as I listen to you, it's in having been in France during the time when, or in Europe during the time when France was beginning to lead in this area. I'm looking forward to our discussion about the hurdles you overcame to implement this, what is becoming one of the most successful programs around the globe. Let me next go to Ali Gourlie. Ali, I'm delighted to have you here with us today. The work that you are doing is quite impressive. You've worked in the West Country, Westminster, and Brussels. You served as head of communications for the European Parliament delegation. You're always passionate about food, and you work as a chef before becoming and entering the world of politics and policy. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And yeah, we're not quite as far along as the presentation you just heard in the UK. I guess that's a gold standard and what we're aiming to do. So we're a bit further back, and hopefully my presentation will sort of set out a road from where we get from where we are to where our friends in France are. So FareShare is the UK's largest food redistribution charity. We take surplus food that would be going to waste from the food industry and get it to a network of about 8,000 charities across the country. So we're kind of like a wholesaler. We don't deal with individuals. We give food to charities who then do all sorts of amazing things with it and get it out to communities with two models. We've got a warehouse model, and the map of the UK, you can see that's where all our warehouses are located. And we also have an application that connects, your local Tesco or Sainsbury's, your local supermarket, to the charities and basically cuts out the middleman. Moving forward, I'd like to just give a brief overview of where we are in the UK at the moment. So we've had a real, post-pandemic, we've had a real inflation problem. It's been especially bad, and we are seeing far more people seek help from the charity sector with food, and people who we wouldn't normally expect to be seeing, people in full-time employment, for example. We are in a period of change, which I guess is the positive aspect of our current situation. So we are currently in a election period, and so everyone's knocking on doors and campaigning. July 4th is polling day, and generally speaking, the pollsters expect the Labour Party to take over. And that presents a bit of an opportunity for policy change, and especially policy change that takes a slightly more interventionist approach, such as the policies that we're advocating for. And Labour have already said, and Labour are the party who are expected to win this election, they've already said they're going to take a more interventionist approach to food policy. So with that in mind, we've written a manifesto, which I'm going to talk about next, that covers what we want to see happen in the United Kingdom. And actually, this wouldn't really be possible without all of the work that our hosts have done and the Atlas. We've based a lot of what we want to happen in the UK on that. This is just a quick slide to show where we are. We're just below 1% in terms of the percentage of our overall surplus that we redistribute. France, Spain, the USA. So that's where we want to head to. And our analysis is that the reasons that these countries are redistributing a higher proportion of their surplus food is basically because they've introduced policies and we haven't. So that's the challenge, get these policies through. Moving on. So this is what our manifesto looks like. This talk is perfect timing because we're releasing it tomorrow. So if you go on our website tomorrow, it will be all over it. It's a pretty comprehensive bit of work we've done. We've been doing it for sort of 6 months or so, and we're pretty pleased with it. So it's launching tomorrow, and on the next slide there are some policies in it. So we've split it into 3 parts. One's about incentives, which largely looks at taxes and subsidies and sort of legal protections, as well as mandatory food waste reporting. And then the second section is about how the government can support redistribution charities through, we've got a grant section there, also improving technology and not doing it all the old-fashioned way, which is how we're doing it at the moment. And then the third section is about how we make this part of, wider environmental policy or food policy or, social policy, and kind of sits our policy space, in context. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to talk about 3 points in the manifesto that relate to taxes and grants. Perfect. So 2.1. This is the point that we've actually spent a lot of time on over the last few years. So basically, there used to be government funding for surplus food redistribution, then it ceased to exist. And we've spent, the last 3 years campaigning to get it reinstated. And we were successful in doing that in February. So that's, the government granting organizations money to redistribute surplus food from a farm level. The problem with grants is that they aren't consistent. They're subject to political winds, right? So, we spent 3 years, without funding, and we want it to write it into policy so that it's not subject to change or a minister's opinion. So 1.1, so we want to write surplus food redistribution from farms into the new farming subsidies. So post-Brexit, the UK has moved away from the common agricultural policy and now has a set of schemes called the environmental land management schemes, where effectively farmers are being paid to deliver public goods. So it could be like maintaining hedgerows or improving water flows, environmental positives for which there is no market. And the idea is you create a market for it. So we're looking at treating surplus food redistribution as a public good, and potentially having farmers paid by the government to redistribute through charities. So that's a way that we're sort of adopting, we're doing sort of a very UK specific policy approach. 1.2 would bring us in line with a lot of other G20 countries where businesses are allowed to offset the cost of their food donations against corporation tax. And so we hope that will tackle, other parts of the food supply chain. So not just focusing on farmers, but, maybe it will unlock more food from manufacturers or even more food from the hospitality sector. And my last slide is basically how we're going to do this. I kind of shamelessly nicked this model from Doug, who you're going to hear from later. But the US have what they call a corn triangle, right? So the food box strategy is how we're going to do it in the UK. So the idea is we'll influence all 4 of these stakeholder groups to implement policy that's beneficial for surplus food redistribution, and then protect that policy once it's there. So, we'll work with politicians, we'll work with, the leaders of the British state, we'll work with the press, and also the food industry membership bodies, as well as academics. And so, if we do our stakeholder engagement and campaigns correctly, we can get all of these groups on board, singing off the same hymn sheet and advocating for policies that will be beneficial beneficial for us, and implement these policies that we have in our manifesto. I think my last slide's a thank you slide. So yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for letting me talk. And the work that the Atlas does is really, 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 really useful for us. It's all based on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ali. As a extraordinary political communication person, your leadership at FareShare as for public affairs and policy and campaigns is recognized by the 15 million pounds that you recently helped FareShare raise. And so I'm looking forward to talking with you during our dialogue about the difference in the money that you've helped FareShare raise and how you expect these new policies at the government that you are putting forth in the manifesto to get the government to drive more capital are different, and how you see leveraging what you raise as FareShare and what you receive from the government to increase participation in the redistribution program in the UK. So this is quite interesting to see how you scale up what has begun as a very strong initiative that FareShare is leading. Our next speaker is Carrie Calvert. Carrie is the Vice President of Government Relations for Feeding America, the largest anti-hunger organization in the United States. Carrie leads Feeding America's legislative strategy on federal nutrition programs, including the Farm Bill, child nutrition legislation, and other food and agriculture issues. Carrie, over to you.
I really appreciate it. So, well, after Earthrin's great introduction, I don't feel that I need to spend a lot of time on this slide about who Feeding America is and the work that we do. But I'd say at our heart, we call ourselves many things. You know, an anti-hunger organization, but food recovery is really at the heart of who Feeding America is. It's why we were started as an association in the late 70s to better coordinate surplus food that couldn't be sold, whether it was back then it was mostly from food manufacturing and retailers. But now the food that we recover is increasingly perishable, and it's from retailers, restaurants, food manufacturers, and ag producers. So the top stat of 92 billion pounds of food that's wasted in the US each year, that's from our friends at ReFed. Really appreciate their work and pulling together national data that helps contextualize the scope of the issue. So through our food recovery efforts last year, 4 billion pounds of nutritious, safe food was kept out of the landfill. Really takes a lot of millions and millions and millions of pickups. You know, our network of 200 food banks has around 3,000 trucks that are constantly on the road. But rather than talk a lot about our food recovery efforts from industry, we're going to talk about the intersection of US government funding and how that helps increase food recovery. But I'm starting with this because aside from donated food and purchased food, federal commodities are a big source of the nutritious food that food banks distribute. So the federal government provides domestically grown commodities to distribute through emergency food assistance programs. Many of those emergency food assistance organizations are food banks. You know, the last couple of years, food banks have seen a significant increase in the amount of food from the US government during the pandemic as programs to help growers that were impacted by the pandemic and the stay-at-home policies, you know, bought the food and redistributed it through food banks to people in need. And Congress provided additional funding. Food banks are feeling a pinch this year as that additional food has decreased, yet demand has increased with food insecurity in 2022, reaching its highest levels since 2014. So food banks are purchasing more food to fill the gap, right? 40% of food banks are trying to increase their purchasing budgets by 20%. Year over year, it's been increasing by an average of 20% as well. And this has an impact on how many resources food banks are able to put into food recovery operations and the choices they're able to make to meet the demand in their community. Certainly, it's our hope that we can support our network in utilizing additional federal and state resources to help meet this demand right now, and that we can advocate in the Farm Bill, which is currently up for reauthorization, on additional resources. So I'm going to transition from the here and now to the 1930s to talk about what began as Depression-era policy, but really has had a significant role to play in connecting surplus U.S. commodities with people in need. So the United States government, they didn't realize it at the time, but some of the actions that they took in the 30s have really had a big impact on food recovery. So during the Great Depression, federal policy in the 20s and early 30s had encouraged overproduction, which led to low commodity prices, surplus food, in the middle of severe food insecurity. And so the US government passed a series of laws to put supports in place. They created the Commodity Credit Corporation in 1933 to stabilize, support, and protect farm income and prices. Most of their work is through direct loan payments to producers, or direct payments to producers as well as loans. The goal there is to ensure that growers and producers aren't going out of business and there's some stability there. First in 1933, and then they needed to make some changes in 1935. The U.S. Government passed the Agriculture Adjustment Act, which established Section 32, which is a permanent source of funding from annual customs receipts to support the farm economy. Now, when the program was first established, the goal was to stabilize prices by removing surplus food from the market, but it missed that key component of connecting the surplus food with people in need, right? So you had, I mean, really severe food insecurity juxtaposed with, you know, animals, you know, piglets not being raised or crops being plowed under, you know, destruction of surplus commodities to stabilize the prices. Thankfully, when there was a different president, you know, Congress revisited this law and realized we can connect this excess food with people in need, and we should do that. And so that really, and that change in 1935 really set in motion what has been a very, has become a very stable source of food for people in need, and really is connecting surplus food from U.S. commodity producers with communities. So, next slide. So Section 32 also helped with the formation of emergency food assistance programs, mostly the Emergency Food Assistance Program, or TFAP. So this starts in 1983, and the light blue or aquamarine color is bonus foods purchased with Section 32 dollars. In the 1980s, dairy policy was producing large amounts of surplus. The U.S. government was buying a lot of cheese and storing it in cheese caves in Kansas City, which are an actual, that is an actual thing. You can take tours there. The caves in that area make it ideal for some food storage. So the U.S. government began redistributing that food through food pantries, food banks, soup kitchens, other direct service organizations and communities, and did quite a bit until things stabilized. Lately, within, I'd say since 2018, as there have been both international trade and tariff issues and COVID-19, we've seen USDA take additional actions to use federal funding to reduce food surplus that's out there. Trade mitigation, which is exactly like it sounds, trying to mitigate the impact of trade decisions on U.S. agriculture exports. USDA purchased foods that weren't being exported due to trade disputes with China and other countries, and purchased that food and redistributed it through food banks and other local organizations. They also provided additional funding to purchase food during the pandemic, and they had a one-year temporary program called the Farmers to Families Food Box Program that really bought a lot of perishable food, both from growers as well as food distributors, when restaurants and other commercial, larger scale consumer establishments were closed down during the pandemic. That really had a significant positive impact on food banks providing, and our ability to serve people in need, providing millions of pounds of nutritious food. But I think the the need to support the grower and the producer comes first, and the side effect, or the silver lining in effect, is the ability to get that nutritious food to people in need. So the US government doesn't probably would not say or identify this as a big food surplus or food recovery program, but we really think it has had a big impact. And then before I close out, I'll talk a bit about we're trying to increase this connection between US funding and food recovery. So in the 2018 Farm Bill, we advocated for, and Congress included, a farm to food bank program within TFAP. So it was established in the 2018 Farm Bill, provides funds to states to enable donation of food produced in the state. It can cover costs for harvesting, processing, packing, or transporting donated commodities. It's funded at $4 million per year, so relatively modest. We really do think additional funding would help this program go a lot further. And it's been a very positive program so far. A lot of states are combining it with other state food purchase programs that they have to maximize resources. And then I guess looking forward and wrapping up, since this is my last slide, I really do feel like there are other opportunities where there's US grants that don't have food recovery at their heart, but really the funding can do both. It can accomplish both things, right? So over 20 states have robust farm to food bank or ag surplus programs. That combined with TFAP Farm to Food Bank, those two programs work very well together, and has had a good impact. Food banks or food bank state associations have also utilized other less likely programs like specialty crop block grants or USDA's local food promotion program, or even smaller programs like the milk donation reimbursement program to strengthen partnerships with local growers, promote local food to new communities, and ensure that excess milk isn't dumped. And that has really helped reduce the amount of food that's either plowed under or goes to waste. So I look forward to our discussion, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today.
Well, Carrie, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to our dialogue together, particularly because so many of the programs that you described have historically supported larger farms and farmers, with some 85%, as I'm sure you know, some 85% of all of the USDA farm subsidy programs go to about 15% of the farmers, but many of the programs that you're describing now, like the specialty crop program and the programs that support food recovery, are supporting smaller and even BIPOC farmers. And so that opportunity to, as you said, not just support farmers, but also to recover food for food security reasons is one that I think we have some, while we have a strong program here in the United States, we have some significant opportunities to make it even better. So thank you again, Carrie. And our fourth and final speaker is Trevor Finley. Trevor is an attorney and clinical instructor in the Food Law and Policy Clinic at Harvard Law School, where he's worked on the Atlas Project since joining the clinic in 2022. Prior to his work at the Food Law and Policy Clinic, Trevor directed federal advocacy efforts for a nonprofit organization focused on organic farming research. And prior to that, he worked on food labeling, agriculture conservation, crop insurance, and on-farm programs at the United States Department of Agriculture. He has a Master of Law in Food and Agricultural Law from the University of Arkansas School of Law. Trevor, over to you, please.
Great, thank you, Eartha. And I'll be emphasizing a few of the points that have already been made and expanding on some of the examples that have already been shared. And then I'll also be talking about some of what you can expect to see in the issue brief about grants and incentives that we'll be publishing later this summer. On the next slide, there are a few points which you may have already picked up on, but I think are worth noting in a little more detail, just about the benefits of using government grants and incentives and how they can fill a gap, both for those that are hungry, as well as those like organizations that are involved in food recovery efforts, as well as farmers that are providing that food. And so both Maywin and Ali mentioned tax incentives, which are obviously a very helpful and useful tool that encourage certain behavior when it comes to food donation. Grants can be a helpful addition to that because they go a step above and beyond providing deductions or credits in the way that taxes do. In our research, we've heard from many potential donors that one of the factors that impacts whether or not they donate food is the costs that they incur in donating it. And oftentimes those are transportation costs or storage expenses while they wait for food to be picked up. And so government grants can, in many cases, offset those costs and give them funds to help build out the infrastructure that reduces those costs and makes them easier to manage. Another benefit of sorry, can we go back to that last slide for a second? Another benefit of government grants is they allow governments to tailor the grant funds to a very specific unmet need. And as I'm sure many people on this call can appreciate, there are a lot of organizations that are doing very impressive work and have the programs in place to get food to people that need it. They just need a little extra assistance. And so government grants, rather than having the government build out the same infrastructure or duplicate that infrastructure or set up a program or an office dedicated to those things, government grants can be a little bit smaller lift for the government and give those funds directly to the organizations that are already doing that work. And then the last thing I'll touch on is obviously grants require funding from the government. And so there are a couple of incentive programs that we found that can also encourage potential donors to actually make those donations and provide them some benefit, non-monetary benefit that might encourage them to donate food as well. On our next slide, we'll focus in on grants in particular. And so there's a couple of different ways that grants can be set up across governments. And we've heard a few examples today. So Carrie, for instance, mentioned a number of grant programs in the United States that are run by the federal government and funded by the federal government. In many cases, those go through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Some of those grant funds are competitive in that there's a certain amount of money and there's a certain topic. And if you have a great idea, you can submit a grant application, and there's a process whereby experts in the field get to review those applications and determine which ones might be best. There's also another way of distributing those funds. The Emergency Food Assistance Program that Carrie mentioned is actually a block grant that goes to states, to states, and then further down to food banks, and that's distributed according to a formula. So there's a set pool of money. There's a formula that's figured out how that money is broken out, and then it's distributed to the organizations that are doing the great work. In our research, we've found, in addition to structuring these in a variety of ways, there's kind of three different pools that these grant funds fall into. The first is for general operating support and infrastructure. An example of that is Canada has a local food infrastructure fund, which kind of includes two different streams. They have one pool that is used directly for infrastructure and equipment at the local level. And then they have a second pool that is more geared towards multidisciplinary efforts to reduce food insecurity in communities. And so kind of a two-pronged approach where they've chose to focus on reducing food insecurity through a couple of different ways and making those grant funds available to local communities to do that. General operating support and infrastructure can also be particularly useful if there's some sort of man-made or natural disaster. We heard earlier that in response to COVID, the US government distributed additional funds to food banks. Similar efforts also took place in the United Kingdom, in Canada, and Australia. And through our work with one of our partners in South Africa, we know that the government there also funded a refrigerated truck that allowed them to recover more surplus food than they previously were able to, and then also distribute that food to rural communities that were also experiencing increased food insecurity. So the first kind of bucket is general operating support and infrastructure, where the food banks and local governments can use those funds in the way that they best see fit. The second kind of pool that we've seen is innovation grants, and we've seen a couple different examples. Ali mentioned a technology system that they have where they connect donors with recipients directly, and so in the past, where you may have had a food recovery organization in the middle of that transaction, the new technology there is allowing the donors and the recipients to connect directly. And so grant funds can be used to create innovative solutions to food recovery like that. We've heard of apps that are operated in a very similar fashion in other countries. Innovation grants can also be used to prolong the shelf life or come up with ways to preserve foods that would otherwise spoil or go bad. And so the UK also has a grant program within the UK Research Institute called Innovate UK, and they have funded a number of efforts, but one in particular would increase the ability for organizations to forecast demand so that they can make smarter purchasing decisions. And then also when they know that demand is unlikely to catch up to supply, they can do something with that excess food, like get it to folks that are hungry. The last kind of bucket that we've seen when it comes to grant funds is education grants. And those can also take a couple of different forms. In some ways, we've seen them be used to just educate consumers on how to properly store food and how to properly use food before it goes bad. A lot of food waste happens at the consumer level, and so grants about ways to minimize food loss and waste in the home are very helpful. In some countries like the United States, where date labels don't oftentimes mean what people think they mean, it's typically an indicator of food quality, not food safety. You can have an education campaign that helps households understand what date labels actually mean, and that in many instances, food is still safe to eat or donate beyond the expiration date. We've also seen some examples of education grants. If there's like a new government program that's being implemented, and for example, if there's an organic waste ban where government has decided that food that's safe and edible can no longer be thrown into the landfill, using education grants to help educate retailers and food manufacturers and other entities throughout the supply chain about these new laws can also be particularly useful. Moving on to the last slide, I'll touch briefly on some of the incentive programs that we've seen. There's one of the perks to incentive programs is, unlike grants, they don't require a large pool of funding from the government, but they can still incentivize food donations and provide public recognition to those that are engaged in food recovery efforts. And so two examples that we've seen, one is in Ecuador, along with passing an organic waste ban. They also have set up a series of incentives to acknowledge donors, so organizations that are donating large amounts of food. And then they've also set up some training programs and some marketing opportunities for those same organizations. They're currently in the process of implementing the law, so we haven't quite seen how that plays out and the actual impact that has, but it's certainly an innovative approach that doesn't cost as much money as providing grant funds do, and creates an incentive for companies to donate food as opposed to do something else with it. Another example is in Mexico, in the state of Nuevo León. We've heard that they have an acknowledgement program where they acknowledge donors, organizations that are donating large amounts of food. I don't know if this is necessarily the case in Nuevo León, but you could also structure these recognition programs. So you have a category of large, like maybe large retail stores or grocery chains, and then you could also have smaller local categories that acknowledge the donations of smaller retail entities, and in many cases they may be donating proportionally a much larger percentage of their food, although it has a smaller impact because they may be based in just one community. So creating different incentive structures and different tiers of incentives can be another way to encourage organizations and companies throughout the supply chain to donate food and be acknowledged for those efforts rather than throwing it into the landfill. The last thing that I wanted to touch on is another thing that will be in the issue brief is we've focused mostly on government grants and incentives. And in many cases, those start at the national level, but they can also be implemented at the state and local level. The issue brief will include a couple of examples of regional banks and then some of the climate commitments and grant funds that came out of COP28 and the emphasis on food at COP28. And so there'll be a couple other programs that are talked about in ways that other grants, if you're in an area where government grants may not necessarily be available, other grant funds that could also be used to implement similar programs. And with that, I will turn it back to Earthren.
For those very, very insightful and helpful comments. And if I can ask all of the panelists to please turn their cameras back on. Thank you all. And well, let's start with you, Mawin. And you've, based on your experiences in France, as you've described them in your presentation, what has worked well in terms of using grants or other incentives to increase food donations, and what has not worked that we should avoid?
So this is an excellent question, and the answer is not really obvious. So as you will have understood, France has put in place a combination of measures, and it's difficult to isolate the effects of a single measure. In fact, the increase in donation in France is due to a multiplicity of factors. What's more, some measures are too recent to be able to assess their overall impact, such as the territorial food project that I mentioned. At this stage, we still do not have evaluation of each law, but I could refer to two evaluation reports on the Garrot law that I mentioned just before, which made a number of observations. So the first one is that tax exemption is a key driver for donation, and in some cases can even permit them. The Garrot law on these provisions that I mentioned before, so including the ban of the destruction of edible food, the respect of the hierarchy of actions to fight against food waste, and also the mandatory proposal of donation agreements, has led to an increase in the volume of donations at the national level. And these measures have also helped to build up a dynamic and better structural partnership between retailers and associations. And this law has made it possible to put in place a solid legal framework for partnerships through the deployment of official agreements. So that's all what I can say now.
And I appreciate your honesty that many of the provisions have not been in place long enough to actually evaluate the success of, and as well as the challenges. You're flying the plane as you're building it, and so you'll learn lessons as you go along. And let me turn to you, Ali, for a second, and also remind our audience that we'd love to have your questions as well. But first of all, you've led a successful campaign that resulted in 15 million pounds in government funding for farm level surplus redistribution. What did you find policymakers were most interested in hearing about when it comes to food recovery and redistribution? And what points or ideas were most persuasive with them? And do you think that as the government is likely to change, that the arguments and the position of government will also change?
Sure. So the biggest blockage for getting the funding reinstated was at an official level. So it was the civil service. And I think that's largely because what we do has both an environmental benefit and a social benefit. So it kind of falls in between departmental responsibilities. So we would have a situation in which DEFRA, which is the Environment Department, would say, "Oh, this is an issue for the Department of Work and Pensions. You know, go and speak to them." And they'd say, "Well, you're dealing with farmers. You know, you need to speak to DEFRA." So ultimately, it was the public-facing campaign, I think, that really sort of shook the can loose, so to speak. We had a paper on side. Evening Standard were very supportive. We did the hard yards in terms of speaking to politicians. I must have spoken to at least 60, 70 Conservative MPs. You know, we had a petition with 100,000 signatures on, and I don't think any one of those things, you know, was the clincher. And actually, you don't know what. It was the Prime Minister making an announcement to a National Farmers Union. You know, I don't know what the decision was in number 10. That maybe it was, "Oh, we've got a speech on Thursday. We've got to announce something." You know, you never know. But I think we had, you know, we built the campaign, and people were taking us seriously, basically. So I think that's what did it. And you know, the challenge is now, you know, in fact, the bid for the process to apply for the fund was meant to launch, you know, at the end of last month, and it didn't launch because the election had been called a couple of days before. So, you know, we're still not home and dry with it. You know, it will launch when the new government's in. So that's certainly the top of our priority list is ensure that when the government comes in, the fund gets launched. The civil servants have done the work on it, and we're very grateful to them. So it's ready to go. But I think part of our problem is, you know, 15 million, whilst it is a lot for us and for the charity sector in terms of actual government spending and government decisions, it's real small fry. So, you know, we've got our work cut out to be heard when, you know, they're making other really important and big decisions as well. Maybe the messaging will change slightly. You know, maybe the arguments that we're making might be a little more on the social side for you know, a left-wing party as opposed to pro-farmer environmental side. You know, but we're used to wrapping our policies based around the audience, right? So yeah, work's cut out.
That's spoken like a true political consulting expert to recognize the need to build the arguments based upon the audience. And in that regard, Carrie, let me come to you, because here in the United States saw an increase in federal funding for food recovery programs during COVID. And so what do you, as we think about how do we move forward, whether it's the Farm Bill or other government programs, what do you see as the future for increased federal funding for food recovery operations? And we know that there's still significant available food that is not recovered. And so you talked about at the farm level, but when you answer, can you think about where the increased funding may be for other areas along the food supply chain?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'll be honest with you, getting funding for the operational day in and day out cost of food distribution, whether it's recovery or purchased food, is a challenge. In fact, you know, there's storage and distribution administrative funding that comes with the Emergency Food Assistance Program federal commodities, and it was cut by 13% last year by Congress, right? So it is an uphill battle to get that what the government sees as the cost of doing business. We're a nonprofit, but they still are thinking, well, why should we pay for your operational costs, even though it is enabling far greater returns? But we saw during COVID that if there's another reason for the funding and you can tie it to something else, then it's easier to get things moving, right? So during COVID, and Arthur and I really appreciated your point about who's getting that money and who are they buying the food from. But during COVID, they bought from large and small growers, producers, distributors, because the point was all these businesses have produced this food that's not being purchased. No one's going to restaurants. They're not eating in cafeterias and institutional settings right now because everyone's at home. So those programs were very popular. Everyone understood they were temporary and for that specific need, but they were very popular. And USDA continued a very small amount of funding for local food purchase agreements. It's a cooperative agreement with federal money. States are deciding how to spend it. The focus is on local growers, preferably socially disadvantaged growers, right? So food recovery is not the goal at the heart of that, but certainly it is part of those purchases, right? So to me, when looking at those lessons, they're more willing to fund it if it's about making sure businesses or growers don't go under in a pandemic, or they're more willing to fund it if it's a local cooperative partnership, right? And it's also supporting local growers or BIPOC growers. I think we need to target our messaging in that frame because, we've been able to get more bipartisan support that way. So USDA used the Commodity Credit Corporation. It's a federal corporation that has funding. Seems like an unending supply of federal funding. They used that to purchase food for food banks last year and this year. We're pushing USDA to buy from smaller growers or use a distributor to buy from new growers, right? There's a lot the federal government can do and how they purchase the food that doesn't necessarily require legislation. So how can we put our hand on the lever that way? How can we encourage them to utilize Section 32 in different ways so that they're not buying like a large institutional nationwide program, but they're able to buy more regionally to take advantage of opportunities that are there. I mean, it costs us more to transport excess produce from South Georgia to other food banks up and down the East Coast then the transportation cost is the largest cost of that, right? So to the extent that we can push the federal government to be a part of that solution, we'd like to move in that direction.
Sure. We know that regional and local purchasing is an efficient way of not only recovering food but making food available to those in need. The challenge is where the need is often not where the food is grown. And so you have the challenge of supporting the movement of that food from where it's grown to where it's needed. Trevor, when we talk about these additional grant dollars to support the increase in recovery of food, you noted, and I underlined, that grants and financial incentives may not be the only way to incentivize and catalyze food recovery effort. You talked about non-monetary incentives. I'd love to hear more about that, and I'm sure our audience would too. Have we seen or identified successful non-monetary incentives for the recovery and of food?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an area where we're seeing more growth. Ecuador is one of the examples I mentioned, and they just at this point, it's probably 2 years ago, passed their law and are still in the process of implementing it. So we haven't quite seen the impact yet. But I think there's a lot of other options too. So I think the examples I gave so far focus mostly on public relations and marketing and appealing to we're doing these great things and acknowledging the companies that are participating in that. But I think there's also government procurement opportunities or contracting opportunities and permitting opportunities where if the government were to say, like, if you have a plan in place to donate any excess food, you'll get additional points in the permitting process, or you'll get additional points in this contracting process. If you can prove that any excess food would go to like a food bank or another recovery organization. And so I think there's other ways to incentivize it that maybe don't necessarily require funds, but other government programs that already exist and integrating it into those and making sure that, especially if it's, anything like where food and agriculture is an important part of that government function, is making sure like at each opportunity for each of those programs that already exist or each of those interactions that already take place, how can we weave food donation into this conversation to make sure it's being considered? And, in some cases, it may not always yield as much food as we think it does, but I think helping people change their mindset and just their planning and the systems and processes that are in place is something that the government can do by looking at their programs, going through them, figuring out where these additional incentives to encourage these organizations to do the right thing. And in many cases, they want to do the right thing. They may not have the time or effort to do it. And so by making it a part of the contracting process or the permitting process, you're encouraging them to do these things that I suspect a lot of them want to do, but just don't have the time and effort to do right now without some sort of additional incentive to do that. And so I think, just being cognizant of like the interactions that already take place and making sure you can build on those by incorporating food donation and food recovery where it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When we know there are limited federal dollars or limited government dollars, identifying those non-monetary solutions for increasing food recovery are going to become ever more critical as we move forward. And those challenges of dollars, and whether it's donor dollars or grant dollars, we also have seen programs where the donors or the grantors prefer to help with projects instead of operating costs. And we have this question from an audience member of is there a way to change this perception to identify and encourage more donors or grantors to support the operational costs, because it is not helpful if we can only support the purchase of the food if you cannot support the transport and the processing and distribution. So I know, Carrie, you talked about this a bit. I'd love to go to Marwan and to Ali and ask either of you if you have thoughts on this issue.
Well, we rely on our partners as a charity, as a non-profit, for all our operations. So our corporate partners are incredibly important, and as are our individual donors. Shout out to Marcus Rashford, the footballer, who during the pandemic gave us a huge amount of money. No fuss about it, no press, just did it. And so that's all generally unrestricted funding, because if you're dealing with either people who really care about your organization, or sometimes like big, like the retailers, for example, they understand like the logistics costs, right? That like, because they have exactly the same costs in their businesses. So I would, I'm sure someone from my fundraising team could give a far better answer than I did, but approach corporates and see if they will help with those sort of operational costs.
Marwan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question as a representative of government on this panel.
Yeah, so I would like to precise the fact that I have a limited perimeter to speak about and to comment politics in France, but I would like just to talk about the approach of France. I strongly believe of the power of the territories. And I believe in the cooperation between actors. So cooperation is put in place in France with the territorial food projects that enable to mutualize logistics questions, but also they enable to put actors in the situation of dialogue. So I believe that this situation and cooperation in territories is also a strong level to increase food donation.
So that takes me to a question I'd like to ask each of you to give us a 1-minute answer on. you've talked about the successful creation of funding streams and even how to access funds for the operations or unrestricted funds to support the organizations, not just the recovery of the food, but the distribution and potentially the processing. What do you hope to see next in this area of funding for recovery that you think would help support the scale up of activity? Because while all of the work that you've described, Trevor, the policies that you identified have begun to recover more food, we are far away from actually recovering enough to say that we have successfully reduced food waste or food loss. So what do you hope to see to see next in this area of funding and grants and just to make it hard for you in that 1 minute, not just what you hope to see next, but how do you think we get there? And I'll start with you, Trevor.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, especially in the backdrop that we've heard today, where hunger has increased pretty dramatically throughout the world. And I think it's especially a challenge given, like, one, we need to make sure as hunger increases, we're able to get food to those that are hungry. And with a growing number, it's hard to do that and focus on the policy side of things. But I think it's important that everybody in the nonprofit sector knows how to walk and chew gum and juggle at the same time, because that's what we're asked to do every day is take a little bit and turn it into a lot. And so I think, have the folks on, the distribution, like the logistics team, do their excellent work. Have the folks on the development side do everything they can. And I think it's very difficult, but I think, I guess my hope in having these conversations and focusing more on the policies that, lead to successful food recovery efforts is that governments will at least start having the conversation alongside, like, the increase in hunger is notable, and there's, I think, efforts in many cases addressing that. But I think it's alongside that, we need to have a conversation about what do successful policies look like, so that the next time this happens, and it will happen, there's natural disasters that cause hunger, there's man-made disasters that cause hunger, and those will continue to happen. What do we do to prepare for the next time? Like, how do we make sure that we have the infrastructure and the systems and logistics and the technology, the people in place to make sure that this doesn't happen, or the next time it does, maybe it's a little bit fewer people that are hungry the next time around. So just having the conversation.
Terrific. So Carrie, over to you. What do you hope to see next? 1 minute.
Yeah. Okay. So, Trevor, you talked about, the increase in domestic and international food insecurity, because I think at the heart of it, these things don't happen in a vacuum, right? I have to call out that the end of the expanded child tax credit at the end of 2021 was a significant factor in child poverty doubling in the United States in 2022, and food insecurity rising to the highest levels since 2014. People need more economic resources to thrive because of the gap between wages and expenses in the United States. Food recovery can be a part of that solution. I think there's a lot of opportunity to look at what the government is willing to fund and add food recovery activities as an allowable thing on this grant and that grant and that grant, right? So that we're expanding the universe of potential funding that can be used for food recovery, since securing additional funds from the government can take a while.
So planning, as Trevor said, and expanding, as you've just given us. Mawan, over to you.
Yeah, as I said, I am not meant and allowed to comment politics today, because we are in a period of reserve influence in the context of the election, the legislative election. But maybe that I could add the fact that maybe that we could turn into a sustainable and quality aid, because some, as you may know, people who are in situation of poverty have often a lack of choice for their diet. So maybe that we could turn into balanced and quality diets for them into to decrease the some I don't know, some problems with their health. So
planning, expanding, and sustainable and quality diets for consumers as a reasoning. Ali, you get the last word. What's the hope for the future, and how do we get there? 1 minute.
Thank you. You might have noticed that the UK's been lacking a little bit of strategy and stability recently. It's been a bit all over the place. So I think the first thing is like have a strategy, right, and stick to it. I think the key thing out of our manifesto, if I could have one thing from it with reference to this topic of discussion, it would be the tax incentives, because businesses are dealing with us out of the goodness of their own hearts, basically, and then there's no economic factor. So address the economic factor, and then how do we get there? It's just building coalitions and campaigning and just lobbying and just talking to as many people as possible and just building a case. And I'm confident. I think we will get there.
I love that confidence. As we close out today, I want to thank you all for your participation, and building coalitions is a great way for us to end this conversation, because if we expect to scale up, and particularly if we're going to scale up using policy incentives, we can't do it alone. So with that, Doug, over to you.
Sorry, all. Thank you, Arthur, and thank you, panelists. It has really been, I think, a very interesting subject, and I hope begins a trend elsewhere around the globe where governments can support through various means the work of food banks, which is so important, both in providing a supplementary social protection to people in need who are food insecure, as well as building up civil society and those that are engaged in hunger relief efforts. I want to thank all the panelists and especially Earthman for presentations. We hope that and encourage all participants to check out and attendees of this webinar to check out the Global Food Donation Policy Atlas website, where you can read in-depth issue briefs, both on government grants and support and incentives to reduce food waste and increase food donations. Please, we ask you to, if you have activities underway in your country, policy movements on government grants or incentives, please reach out to GFN or FLPC to let us know about those efforts so we can incorporate those into future issue briefs. Please stay tuned for future sessions on the work of the Food Donation Atlas, and we want to thank all those who've stayed for the webinar. We hope that found this useful. Thank you so much.